I propose a new temporary worker program that will match willing foreign workers with willing American employers when no Americans can be found to fill the jobs.
Every year, 66,000 temporary workers from abroad enter the United States with H-2B visas. Regions like the devastated Gulf Coast illustrate how both local workers and guest workers are losing out.
After Hurricane Katrina, hundreds of thousands of local workers, mostly black working class people, lost their jobs, lost their homes, lost their livelihood. Unemployment rates were soaring. Some people say over 40% of the city was actively looking for work.
It's been 3 years since Hurricane Katrina battered the Gulf Coast, and many natives still struggle to find work.
It's just hard, you know. I mean, you try to make a living. You got people been on jobs 30, 40 years. You know what I'm saying? But when they come back, they ain't got no job. Mexican came and took their job.
Well, that's why you got a lot of people that's not working, because even if they do work, they're not going to get what they want to be paid for. But you got the immigrants, they come in, which, they're trying to do the same as us, support their family, but they're cutting us out of jobs.
Me personally, I have no problem with it. But I will say this, I don't like the fact that they pay them so cheap and then they get all the work when they do have a lot of people here who want to work, like myself, but who are not willing to work for minimum wage doing hard labor.
The federal government encourages companies to compete for the cheapest worker. That's still the logic of employment in the Reconstruction.
Despite an eager workforce at home, many Gulf Coast companies turned elsewhere.
അമേരിക്ക എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ് കേട്ടിട്ടുള്ളപ്പോൾ തന്നെ എൻ്റെ കുട്ടിക്കാലം മുതൽ ഞാൻ കേട്ട് വരുന്നത് വളരെയധികം സമ്പൽ സമൃദ്ധിയായിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു ദൈവാനുഗ്രഹം നിറഞ്ഞ നാടെന്നുള്ളതാണ് ഞാൻ കേട്ടിട്ടുള്ളത്. ഞാൻ എൻ്റെ കുട്ടികൾക്ക് നല്ലൊരു ഫ്യൂച്ചർ, അതായത് അവരുടെ വിദ്യാഭ്യാസം നല്ല സുരക്ഷിതവും കൊടുക്കാൻ ഈ നാട്ടിൽ കഴിയും.
They came to work every possible job you could imagine. These were jobs that local people were looking for, but guest workers got.
Initially, most of the work was around the construction industry, and then it started to morph into other things. And so it was really kind of like, okay, we found this vulnerable, cheap labor supply. We can start using them in other things now.
One marine construction company brought hundreds of welders and pipe fitters from India to work in its shipyards.
Signal International wanted a labor force of guest workers, cheap, exploitable labor from another country that could be kept on company property and used to cut costs.
ഞങ്ങൾക്ക് അതിൻ്റെ ആവറേജ് ഒരു $20,000 ഞങ്ങളിവിടെ കൊടുക്കേണ്ടി വന്നു. അവർ പറഞ്ഞു 12 മാസത്തിനകത്ത് ഈ നിങ്ങളുടെ ഗ്രീൻ കാർഡ് കംപ്ലീറ്റ് നിങ്ങൾക്ക് തന്ന് നിങ്ങളെ ഈ USA ജോലിക്ക് വിധേയരാക്കും.
All the promises were false. There were never any green cards. There was never any permanent residency. There were never any family visas. Workers had paid $20,000 for a 10-month-long H-2B visa. Workers found themselves being held in forced labor in these labor camps that company officials themselves called the man camp facilities.
They put us in a trailer room with 24 other people, and the living condition was too horrible. Like I am always saying that it was a condition like pigs in a cage. And when we start for better accommodation and food and other treatment, they start to say that this is not your India, this is America. If you want to stay in this country, you must keep quiet, shut up and sit down.
Just think about it. If you come into a job with $20,000 of debt, your employer can do whatever he or she likes with you. That's the situation these workers were in. These Indian workers, because of the terms of the guest worker visa, could not work for anyone else, and because of their debt, they could not go back to India. So they were virtually in servitude to Signal International.
Despite Signal's attempts to squash organizing efforts, in March of 2008, over 100 employees in Pascagoula, Mississippi, threw down their hard hats and walked off the job.
Bad as those conditions were, if they lost that job and could be deported because they violated that H-2A law or whatever, that's a hell of a risk. Bad as those conditions were, they was getting a paycheck. Bad as those conditions were, they were sending money home.
Guest workers who have come to the Gulf Coast, including these Indian workers, have sat down and told their story to members of the African American community. And the story basically is, you can only work for one employer. You have to live on company property. When we escaped, they started chasing us and hunting us down. They told us we were fugitives. When African American community members have heard that story, what they've said is, well, gosh, that sounds a lot like slavery. That sounds a lot like what happened to us.
After walking out of Signal, workers marched on foot from New Orleans, Louisiana to Washington, D.C. in order to draw attention to the exploitation of guest workers.
They said, we're gonna act in the spirit of Mahatma Gandhi, and we're gonna go to Washington, and we're gonna hold a hunger strike. And they went on hunger strike longer than Mahatma Gandhi. What can you say to something like that?
ഇങ്ങനെ ഒരു ഹങ്കർ സ്ട്രൈക്ക് ഡേ ബൈ ഡേ ഞാൻ 23 ദിവസം കംപ്ലീറ്റ് ചെയ്തു. ഈ ഹങ്കർ സ്ട്രൈക്ക് ഞാൻ ഇറങ്ങിയത് എൻ്റെ പാരൻസിനെ പറ്റിയോ ഞാൻ എൻ്റെ മക്കളെ പറ്റിയോ എൻ്റെ കുടുംബത്തെ പറ്റിയോ ഞാൻ ചിന്തിക്കാത്തത് ആരെങ്കിലും ഒരാൾ ഒരു വ്യക്തി ഇതിൻ്റെ പുറകിൽ ഇറങ്ങി ഇതിനെ നേരിട്ടാൽ മാത്രമേ ഇത് ഈ ലോകത്ത് മറ്റുള്ളവർക്ക് ഇതേപോലെയുള്ള ഒരു പ്രയാസം പ്രശ്നങ്ങൾ ഉണ്ടാകാതിരിക്കുകയുള്ളൂ.
The workers stood at the end of the hunger strike in front of the Department of Justice. They were joined by a congressman. They held in their hands the signatures of 3 major congressional committees.
A few weeks ago, I met with a delegation of Indian workers. They came to the United States to help clean up and rebuild the Gulf Coast in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Upon their arrival, their nightmare began.
This was not just a testimony about a kink in the system. The workers were pointing to things that were fundamentally wrong with the way that workers migrate to the United States.
From the unemployed workers who lived in the Gulf states to those who came in the guest worker program, it all comes down to oppression. We don't stand against each other. We stand for each other in the midst of all this.
കത്തലിക് ശേഷം ഈ യു എസിലെ ഇവിടുത്തെ സിറ്റിസന് അവർക്ക് ജോലിയില്ല, അവർക്ക് താമസിക്കാൻ വീടില്ല, അവർക്ക് ഭക്ഷണമില്ല. ഇവിടെ കോടാനുകോടി ജനങ്ങൾ ഇവിടെ കിടന്ന് കഷ്ടപ്പെടുന്നുണ്ട് ഈ രാജ്യത്തിൽ.
It's a little upsetting, but I try to work with and get along with everyone right about now because I see nothing but one color right now. Everyone just work together, hard sweat, blood, tears, and try to rebuild the city. That's it. That's the only thing I see.
It's been 6 months since Signal workers walked off the job. Many are now living undocumented, and their families continue to be burdened by painful separation and extraordinary debt.
Meanwhile, Signal continues to run a very profitable business. The recruiters and subcontractors involved continue to run a very profitable business. And in backdrop to all this, Congress continues to talk about an expansion of the H-2B visa program.
It's not just about the Indian workers. It's about Black workers. It's about Latino workers. It's about all of us being exploited on this race to the bottom. I think that any time that we allow someone who is in our country to be treated like they are less than human, and we don't afford them all of the rights that we have as Americans, that we're putting our own selves in danger. Because if it can happen to them, it can happen to us.